Could we see a simplified tax regime? A key expectation from the Union Budget to be presented on February 1 will be simplified tax laws as promised in the last Union Budget in July, for which much work has been done and opinions and feedback solicited. Some 22 subcommittees are working feverishly on the simplification process, but it may not make the deadline in its entirety, though those changes could materialize a little later. Other reports suggest there could be illustrations and examples in the new tax code so that both the taxpayer and the taxman find it easy. But the larger pitch continues to be a simpler tax administration and less litigation. On the other hand, tax collections could slow in coming months as the spike in personal incomes thanks to a booming market could slow down. I spoke with Himanshu Parekh, partner and head of tax West at KPMG in India, and I began by asking him how he was seeing collections before moving on to what he was expecting in terms of larger reforms in the new tax laws.
We've seen pretty robust tax collections in this year. So when you look at the income tax collections for the period April to December 2024, the gross tax collections have been 20% higher than the last year. And the net tax collections, and by net I mean the gross tax collections less the refunds issued to the taxpayers, that has also grown at a very decent pace of 16.5% over the last year. And if you look at the GST collections, they have also been pretty decent. We've had a 10% growth in the period April to December this year as compared to the last year. So when you look at it on an overall basis, with a forecasted GDP growth of about 6.4 to 6.5%, I think tax collections have seen a very, very robust growth, and that's quite encouraging.
Right. And do you feel, for example, that one of the reasons we've seen a bump up in personal tax collections is because of the increased activity in the equity markets, which may not last into the next calendar?
You're right. Yes, that has been one of the key reasons for the spike in the personal tax collections. What's also helped is that now when it comes to personal taxes, you have two regimes. One is the erstwhile regime, and then you have the new regime, which is very simple in nature because you have liberalized tax slabs and higher exemption limits under the new regime, but without the benefit of any incentives or exemptions or deductions. But taxpayers are finding it quite simple to comply with the new tax provisions as compared to the erstwhile regime. And therefore, you see higher number of tax compliances also and higher number of tax returns getting filed this year as compared to the past. So that's also one of the key reasons for seeing a spike in the revenue collections.
Right. Okay, let's come to Budget 25-26. I mean, of course, there are many areas which have been addressed or have been proposed in terms of changes, and the government itself had initiated a exercise to rewrite the Tax Act 61. Now, some of the changes that have been reported as likely include, broadly under the head of simplification, income tax computation structures to be replaced by formulas, tabular depiction for identical taxpayers for easier understanding, reducing the number of forms. So these are some of the things that we've been hearing. What's your sense, Himanshu?
So 2-3 things that we are expecting from this budget. One is, of course, there's been a lot of noise surrounding this simplification exercise. So there is a committee which was formed by the government a few months back. And in fact, there are some 22 subcommittees which are currently working on this simplification exercise. What we understand is that these subcommittees are currently spending the midnight oil working across the clock with a view to simplify a lot of tax provisions which are ambiguous in nature. As you rightly said, the attempt is to not only reword the provision in a simple manner, but to give some illustrations, examples, so that it becomes much easier for both the taxpayers and the tax administration to understand and interpret the law. Once those recommendations get finalized, they will have to be run past with the Ministry of Law for the final amendments to take place. And one hopes that we should see something meaningful emerge out of this exercise in the forthcoming finance bill, which will be presented by the finance minister on 1st February. Clearly, they are running against time here. Let's see what exactly emerges out of this exercise by 1st February. So that's one major expectation. The other major expectation, Govit, is vis-a-vis rationalization and simplification of the TDS regime. So as things stand today, you have roughly about 35 TDS provisions in the income tax law, which has made the entire TDS regime very, very complicated. You have varying tax rates across a variety of transactions, and which have resulted in a lot of interpretation issues, a lot of ambiguities, and litigation on that front. And there's been a long outstanding demand of the industry to simplify the TDS regime, something similar to the simplification exercise that we saw in the last budget vis-a-vis capital gains tax regime. The expectation is that this year we should see a simplification of the TDS regime in the sense that one is expecting that there need not be more than 3 or 4 rates of TDS. So there could be one standard rate which will be applicable for all salaried employees, which will depend, of course, on the salary income of the employees and as per the normal slab rate. There could be one higher rate of TDS vis-a-vis people who earn casual income like lottery income and gaming income, so on and so forth. Then there should be one standardized rate which should apply to variety of transactions, be it rent, be it royalty, be it commission, service fee, works contract, so on and so forth. And then there's an expectation that wherever we have this very low rate of TDS, which is 0.1%, which applies, say, to e-commerce transactions or on purchase of goods above a particular threshold, that those provisions should be abolished because a 0.1% rate of TDS does not lead to any significant revenue augmentation. At the same time, it proves to be an administrative nightmare for taxpayers. So some major expectations as far as TDS regime is concerned. The one other major expectation from this budget is for the government to make some concrete announcements in terms of what measures are they proposing to adopt for avoidance of tax disputes and resolution of existing tax disputes. So two major expectations. One is going forward, can we come up with some kind of a mediation or a settlement scheme, something similar to the APA regime that we have in transfer pricing, whereby we allow the taxpayers and the tax department to settle disputes right at inception so that it does not result in any long-term litigation at all? And as far as the current backlog of litigation is concerned, what can the government do in terms of clearing the current backlog of the appeals which are especially pending at the first level of appellate authority, which is the commissioner appeals? As we talk, there's about 12 trillion rupees of tax amount which is locked up in litigation today, and I'm talking only about income tax. And we have more than 6 lakh appeals which are pending disposal across different appellate forums, with almost 90% of them pending with the first appellate authority being the commissioner. We are again expecting some major announcements to come in this budget vis-a-vis aspects surrounding resolution of existing disputes and how do we go about avoiding disputes from arising going forward. So to my mind, Govind, these are some of the major expectations from the budget this year.
And I'll come to some of the other expectations. But before that, you mentioned TDS. How many rates do we have today?
Almost 35 TDS provisions. So you've got rates varying from 0.1%. In some cases, you've got a rate of 1%, then you have a rate of 2%, 5%, 10%, and 30 and 40% also in some cases. So you've got lots of rates currently in vogue.
So you're saying we have 35 TDS. So when you say provision, you mean provision for rate or provision to charge?
So you have 35 income tax sections dealing with TDS on different varieties of transactions.
Right. And that you feel should be brought down to about 3 to 4.
There can be n number of transactions which can be subjected to TDS. That's not a problem. But let there be no more than 3 or 4 different rates which should be applicable. So it becomes much easier to comply with the TDS regime.
Right. And the government's thinking, it seems, in the past has been that we apply this 0.1% to tag the transaction rather than to tax it.
You're absolutely right. In today's era of GST, Govind, it's possible to track each and every transaction through the GST regime. And if that be so, the government has already sort of got the mechanism to track all those transactions through the GST regime. And if that be so, can we go about and abolish this 0.1% TDS, which results just in a duplication of effort, nothing else?
Right. So you talked about these 22 subcommittees who are working on simplification and racing against a deadline of barely 2 weeks from here. So looking at the kind of effort that we've seen in the past, in these areas, administration, simplification, ease of doing business, how do you rate our chances this time?
To me, it seems to be a Herculean task. And I would be very, very surprised and amazed if you were to see this exercise getting consummated and seeing some tangible outcome therefrom in the forthcoming budget. I would be very surprised to see that happen in this budget.
Right. So, having said that, you, however, feel that since we are putting in this effort, at some point it should bear fruit.
Definitely, you should expect that in the forthcoming months, for sure.
Right, Himanshu. Thank you so much for joining me and sharing your thoughts.
Pleasure. Thank you, Govind.